In studio with our good buddy, Dr. Peter Hammond, a Frontline Fellowship, all the way in from South Africa, giving us a little bit of a history on this here nation from which you come, to tell us about Nelson Mandela, because the perception in the US of A is he's a wonderful fellow. We should love him. We should honor him just like our president does. That's the way he was portrayed in the movie Invictus with Matt Damon. It was produced and directed by Clint Eastwood. And he's Republican. He spoke at the convention, so it all must be good. You say, big thumbs down. What's the problem with Nelson Mandela and Invictus?
The question they never answered in that film or in most of the propaganda pieces, why was Mandela in prison? The impression given is because he was black, because he was against apartheid, against discrimination, he is for freedom. The man's a prisoner of conscience, but actually Amnesty International never took his case because they said he was not a political prisoner. He had had a fair trial and he had a very restrained sentence for crimes that he pleaded guilty to. 156 acts of public violence and terrorism, actually.
156.
6 public
acts of violence. And he pled guilty to those charges.
And he's trained as a lawyer, so he knows what that means.
Yeah.
So the context was the ANC were a terrorist group fighting a vicious war, and we had Soviet warships in our neighboring countries, Mozambique and Angola. The whole hierarchy of the Warsaw Pact were there, and they were offloading the Cuban trucks and tanks and missiles and into Angola, and Cuban troops were goose-stepping down the streets in our neighboring capitals.
Okay, what year are we talking about here?
1960s, 70s,
All right.
into the 80s. So when Carter was president, they came in. When Reagan was president, they were fighting, and we were in a very hot war. Soviet missiles in our neighboring countries. Now, you thought missiles in Cuba was a bad idea. We thought missiles in Angola and Mozambique was a bad idea for our security.
All right,
as well.
now you need, just for ANC, what's the ANC?
African National Congress, or Abortion, Necklacing and Communism Party, or Abortion, Nepotism and Corruption Party. But they're the bad guys.
Okay, so they're the bad guys. And Nelson Mandela's relationship to them was?
He was the head of their military wing, the terrorist wing, Umkhonto we Sizwe, the spear of the nation. So he was trained by Che Guevara and by the Cuban DGI in order to how to plant bombs and make car bombs and kill people.
Okay, and you use the term necklacing for people who are not hip on your terminology.
I've got some pictures of that just now. It's a form of assassination. So we've got a real threat. You'll notice Che Guevara's nice ugly mug up there on the wall. And Uncle Fidel Castro was visiting one of his latest colonies, this being Angola. There were tens of thousands of Cuban troops in 13 countries in Africa, including 60,000 Cuban troops just in Angola, on our border. And they were burning, bombing, destroying, wrecking churches, putting people against the tree and shooting them without trial, landmines. We had terrorists coming across the border, doing atrocities like these, tying up people with wire and bayoneting them in the back, shooting village headmen, chiefs, murdering missionaries. I mean, this is the context of why Mandela was in prison, because we were facing a violent terrorist assault. This is Red Cross ambulance workers shot out. This man had his lips and ears cut off, and he was forced to have his wife cook and eat them. This woman had her lips cut off because she spoke out against the communists. And this is Robert Mugabe's ZANU-PF who did that one. Missionaries and their kids murdered, bayoneted on the fields. Whole families killed by landmines planted in the roads. And this is what the ANC's own propaganda posters had, which was death to apartheid, long live Umkhonto we Sizwe. These are the weapons they used. And Nelson Mandela organized the plan, Operation Mabuyu, which was for these plastic explosives and landmines, as you can see in a picture here, in order to attack farmhouses, railway stations, people in public areas.
Okay, so the connection between Nelson Mandela and Cuba and Fidel Castro and Soviet Union.
Completely and utterly integrated.
So Nelson Mandela would not be considered a Democrat, a Republican, or a capitalist?
No, he was a communist. In fact,
flat out.
One of the uncontested pieces of evidence against him at his trial, the Rivonia trial, was how to be a good communist in his own handwriting, 65 pages. You can actually access it on the web. In his own handwriting. And he did not contest that that was his publication. He wrote How to be a Good Communist, 65 pages of it. Look at this ANC Umkhonto we Sizwe. Now, Nelson Mandela was the head of the armed wing, the spear of the nation, called Umkhonto we Sizwe, at the 25th anniversary, what are they symbolizing? AK-47s, grenades, and a petrol bomb with an automobile tire, which symbolized the necklacing. You put an automobile tire over someone, pour petrol over them, set them alight. That is called necklacing. 1,000 people were necklaced by the ANC. That's black people burned alive by this hideous, torturous method. And here you can see the Communist Party infiltration of the ANC. The entire executive of the African National Congress was actually communists, Communist Party members. And this was proved and shown to be completely controlled and directed by the Soviet Union. This, by the way, is from evidence entered in at the US Senate hearings on the Soviet infiltration of the ANC, supervised by Senator Jeremiah Denton. And these are what the Soviets are bringing in. The thousands of tanks and artillery pieces and missiles coming into our neighboring countries. This wasn't just somebody writing a poem. We were talking about not just violent terrorism in the country, we're talking about a conventional military threat on our borders. That's the reality. Soviet flag, ham and sickle, and church members being co-opted into this. This little girl, she was burned by a suitcase bomb with fuel in it, placed in Johannesburg Central Station by Umkhonto we Sizwe, and this is something that Nelson Mandela pleaded guilty to. This is one of the 156 acts of terrorism, which people died. Her grandmother died. This girl was scarred for life. Car bombs on the streets. This is the Church Street bombing. Now, we know the IRA did this. We know that the Palestinian Liberation Organization did it, but the ANC did it too. You had a bombing in Boston a while ago, and your president said anyone who placed a bomb in a public place is a terrorist. Well, Nelson Mandela's ANC did this, but he calls him a role model.